How's everyone doing? Good? My name is Ryan Howells. I'm with Levitt Partners and also the CARIN Alliance, along with my colleague here, Amol Vyas, who's with Solutions Architect from Cambia Health Solutions. We're pleased to be with you to talk about the work that CARIN is doing to build out FHIR implementation guides. So just let's get a sense of the room. How many health plan representatives do we have in the room? Seriously, like 4. Boy, are you serious? Like the proposed rule comes out and the whole place isn't like jam-packed with folks? That is incredible. Okay, wow, yeah, no, a little scary, huh? Well, how many vendors do we have in the room? Okay, you're gonna help build it for the plans, correct? Is that the plan? That's why you're here? How many are you here because your plan said you need to go figure out what this FHIR thing is all about? Thank you for being honest. That was excellent. That's very good. We're pleased to be here and talk to you a little bit more about what we're doing to really expedite the opportunities that are available to us. And so let's kind of dive in. So the way that we in the CARIN Alliance kind of look at things is that we look at it actually everything that all the data exchange outside what I affectionately call the HIPAA box. How do we actually get the data from the business sense to the consumer side of things? So we call that consumer-directed exchange. It's all business to consumer related data exchange. And it's all empowered, obviously, by the FHIR API infrastructure that we're actually developing. We believe kind of at our core that along with all the good work that many folks are doing, like Vinci that's here, and Care Equality and Commonwealth, and all those folks that are focusing in on interoperability within that HIPAA box between different covered entities and business associates, we think we can make a profound difference in actually empowering consumers with access to their digital health information and aggregating that to an app of their choice, and then being able to aggregate that information in such a way that allows for that consumer to aggregate it across plans, across providers, because we believe that consumers are the only constant within healthcare is to make that happen. So we are very supportive of all the stuff that's happening in that HIPAA box, and we want that to work swimmingly and want everyone to make that happen. But we also believe that we have a unique once-in-a-generation opportunity to empower consumers with access to their digital data. So that's where we play. The other thing that you need to, I think the folks need to understand, I think that was consistent with the proposed rules that actually came out, is that when that data moves from the HIPAA covered entity environment and it moves into essentially the consumer space, that data, even if it's protected and protected health information, is now moving into a space that's overseen by the Federal Trade Commission. So it no longer, even if it's PHI-related data, is covered by HIPAA. It's actually covered by FTC Section 5, which basically says do no harm to the consumer. And if, in fact, the industry doesn't rally around a set of kind of key principles or ideas for how to protect that data is out there, and it's just really overseen by the terms and conditions of the individual app vendor. So we won't touch on it here, but one of the things that we've tried to do within the CARIN Alliance is try to find ways where we can protect that data by getting the industry to agree on a set of core principles for how that data should be protected. And that's called our CARIN Code of Conduct. It's on our website. We released a first version in November of last year. We released an updated version last month as well, which is the first official version that's out there after receiving a ton of industry feedback. And our hope is that that code of conduct can be used. We're working with different data holders right now to be able to take the information, and when an app comes in and registers for the data with the actual data holder, that they can self-attest to that code of conduct so that they can essentially be held accountable to protecting that information outside of the HIPAA environment. This world of consumer-facing apps getting access to FHIR APIs is really, really new. There's obviously Apple on one end and Google and others that are big companies that are actually focusing on that. And there's a bunch of startup companies as well. And there's very few that are in between. And so we want to make this ecosystem work for everybody. And our hope is that as these apps are self-attesting to the code, it provides a common way in which that information can be protected. The other interesting thing is that we think that lays the foundation for exchanging more data with consumers once we move forward. And again, we won't go into it today, but in the CARIN Alliance, we're working on other kind of key problems. For example, if a true consumer-facing environment is supposed to operate at scale, we need to get out of our portal infrastructure problem that we have today, right? We've got to just completely get out of that, but we still need to protect the information. So for us, from a portal perspective, we're saying instead of, and by the way, we're huge supporters of SMART. Go implement SMART if you're a plan or provider. Do that tomorrow or today, whatever you can do. That is absolutely the way that we need to exchange the information, authenticate the actual individual users. But for someone with a chronic condition that has seen 10 different providers and 2 or 3 different plans over the last 5 years, trying to aggregate their information and remembering all that portal information is a nightmare. So what we're trying to do is to figure out a way where we can develop a trust ecosystem that with the publication of the API endpoints, which the CMS and ONC rules are now requiring, we can find a way where that API endpoint information can be published, and then that information can then be shared in a very trusted way across the ecosystem using a set of certifications and other things from a technical perspective, as well as the code of conduct from a policy perspective in meaningful ways. So we're looking at things like digital identity and working with folks even outside of healthcare on what that looks like and how we could actually identify those individuals across systems. Because we don't do a good job in healthcare right now identifying unique people. We identify companies really well. We identify individuals sort of well within our own institution, but when it comes to digitally identifying individuals remotely across systems, we don't do that well today. The good news is no one really does it well, and so it's a really hard problem to solve. So we're trying to lead the way in what that kind of looks like. So we can talk about digital identity and authentication using OAuth and OpenID and other things to make that happen offline if you're interested. So again, our vision, rapidly advance the ability for consumers and their caregivers to easily get, use, and share their information, digital health information, when, where, and how they want to achieve their goals. This is just a small sampling of who we have involved. We've got more than 50 organizations involved. Kaiser has recently joined. Epic has recently joined. We have Cerner and Allscripts. We have Humana, the association, Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, a lot of major payers. They're all listed on our website, carinalliance.com, CARIN, if you'd like to be able to take a look at who's there, just to give you a small sampling. And it's a very multi-sector group by design. The hope is we could have consumer-facing apps along with payers and plans and pharma providers and consumer platform companies all coming together, agreeing on what these standards need to look like from a policy and technical perspective. So how many of you heard of the Standards Accelerator program from HL7? A handful? Okay, for those of you who have not heard, just this side of the room, that's interesting. Just the right side of the room. Standards Accelerator program was something that HL7 came out with, I should say, at HIMSS earlier this year. It is a set of implementers or implementing organizations that have come together to try to advance or accelerate the standards process, specifically the development of FHIR implementation guides to make this process go hopefully a little bit more efficiently. So historically, when we've developed standards, we've started in that upper right-hand quadrant. We've had a bunch of standards, I like to call them Lego blocks on the floor, that we've said, here's what we'd like to do. A lot of really smart people got in a room and said, here's how we think we should develop a balloted approach to making this happen. Let's develop an implementation guide. And then let's go kind of beg our friends and family and our employers, for example, to try to implement these standards at scale. And so they would go to the implementers, and oftentimes that's the area where it would sometimes fall down. Unless there's a regulation behind it, a lot of people are busy, they may not actually move this forward in a meaningful way. Graham's in the room. I think one of the things he had a vision of, and I think we had as well early on, is we should start in that bottom left-hand corner instead. what if we got a group of implementers together, folks that actually want to implement these standards, and from a business perspective, both in terms of B2B and B2C, how do we expedite this in a meaningful way? Regulators are helping. Thank you, Steve, and others that are there to help from an ONC and CMS perspective. But if the implementers got in a room and said, actually, this is what we need from a strategic business perspective, we want to drive this process and leverage and utilize all the great work that's already being done in the standards-making bodies up in the upper right-hand corner, and then develop an implementation guide, hopefully we can start to accelerate that because it's being driven by a specific business or regulatory need. As probably a lot of you know, there was 2 proposed rules that actually came out from ONC and CMS earlier this year as well in March, and just recently the comments got finalized the early June. Those 2 proposed rules said a bunch of things about interoperability, but most importantly, they basically said that consumers have a right to access their clinical and claims information through a third-party app of their choice using these FHIR APIs. So our focus has been primarily on the consumer and third-party apps. There are others on this group that are focusing in other areas. Vinci, as you know, is focusing on the provider and payer value-based care use cases between business-to-business entities, and then Argonaut is focused on provider-to-provider as well as provider-to-consumer use cases as well that have been done. And we're focusing on as I mentioned, 2 use cases, payer to consumer, as well as pharma to consumer as well, which we'll talk about. So there was this rule. How many read the 1,000 pages? Anybody in the room 1,000 pages? No, nice job, nice job. There'll be a quiz at the end, so it's okay. There was a CMS proposed rule that, as we mentioned, came out. This gives you a nice little graphical chart on what that rule says. I think what's unique about this rule is a few things. One is it is the first, I think the first time in which CMS or any federal agency is mandating that digital health information is exchanged outside of HIPAA. That has never happened before, to my understanding, unless someone correct me, in the history of this country. That poses a lot of interesting and unique challenges for us as an industry, from a privacy and security perspective, from an ability for us to really try to maintain this information, and the very core key question of how HIPAA plays a role in the future. We have to find ways where we can be able to make sure that that data is protected regardless of where it is. Now that we're mandating the data get shared outside of HIPAA, we're going to have to get really creative about, regardless of where the data is, it's still PHI, and regardless of who has it, even these third-party apps, we need to protect it in a secure way. The other thing that this rule does, which is interesting, is that it also is requiring for certain data elements that information is sent through FHIR APIs, actually called out in the rule. That's unique because those of you who work with health plans know that health plans work in the X12 EDI environment. In fact, that's mandated through National Center for Vital Health Statistics that happens. That's the reason we do that, and we've done it for 2 decades. Now we're talking about FHIR APIs, which also presents a really interesting issue, because we have to say to ourselves, do I now create 2 specific data infrastructures? Do I have an API infrastructure, and do I have an EDI infrastructure? Do I map EDI directly to APIs? Do I map it directly from my source system? These are questions that we're just starting to ask. And oh, by the way, are we going to move completely over to FHIR-based APIs for the payer environment? Those are all things that hopefully we'll try to ask and answer in the future. But I think the rule starts to really be significant in the sense that we are modernizing our entire health IT ecosystem in the entire country. That's what these rules are really looking to do and making this happen. And then the final point is there is some information in here about what we'll talk about later, which is payers now need to actually send EOB claim information to patients through a third-party app of their choice. That's where CARIN is involved. Right now, the proposed rule says by January of next year. I'm not going to speculate per se, but It may stay in January, it may get delayed a year, it may get delayed 2 years. Those are probably the three answers that I would say are out there right now as to where this actually falls into place. We are anticipating that it stays January of next year, and we've done a lot of work to get us to that point, and we've also spoken to a lot of providers who've actually implemented the FHIR Argonaut API to know that 6 months is actually enough time to make this happen once you stand up the FHIR API server to make it happen. So we're going to spend most of our time on what we call the CARIN Blue Button implementation guide. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the second implementation guide that we're working on called Consumer-Facing Real-Time Pharmacy Benefit Check. And so what consumer-facing real-time pharmacy benefit check is that NCPDP, which is the standards-making body for the pharma industry, have created a standard, and the standard I think will be finalized most likely about Q3 of this year, which allows for in the business-to-business environment, so in other words, from a health plan PBM to a pharmacy organization, to allow that data to get exchanged via EDI in either what's called a script or telecom standard to do a few different things. Number one, it provides formulary and benefit information to the actual provider themselves. I'm sorry, I'm reading there at the bottom. It also provides out-of-pocket cost information so that the individual provider can actually see whether or not that information is the drug that they're actually going to prescribe, what that's going to do to an out-of-pocket perspective to the actual patient themselves. It also provides therapeutic alternatives as well so that the physician has at the point of prescribing a list of those different therapeutic alternatives for the individual patient themselves. What it doesn't have is a cash price alternative, which I'll talk about here in a second. But what's driving this is that there was a law that was passed back in December of last year called the Patient's Right to Know Drug Prices Act. And what that basically says is it says that pharmacies, by law now, must tell you whether or not the cash price or the formulary price is cheaper at the point of at the point of dispensing. There is no operational way to implement that today, and so we're hopeful that this FHIR API that we're going to build is going to help with that specific mandate. There was also a real-time benefit tool final rule that came out that talked about this business-to-business interchange, and that's the reason NCPDP is kind of finalizing that standard as we speak. And then obviously the CMS, as we mentioned, the NPRM that came out also talks about this. So there's a lot of regulatory push toward that, and if anybody's following any of the information in the news, pharmacy drug prices is a big topic, bipartisan, by the way, to make that happen. So what are we uniquely doing? We are going to take as a baseline that B2B standard that NCPDP is developing for telecom and script, and we're going to map that to a FHIR API standard. And we're going to take in formulary benefit information, out-of-pocket cost information, therapeutic alternatives, and we're also adding cash price. So those of you who are familiar, anybody use GoodRx in the room? Yes? So interest, thank you, Dave, good to see you. GoodRx is a fascinating product that's free and openly available to anybody, that is also an open API that allows you to understand what the cash price would be if you just pay out of pocket. There's 10 million people on that platform every single month. 70% of them actually have employer-sponsored health insurance, and 50% of the time when they look up their individual drug, it's cheaper for them to pay cash than it is to pay on their formulary. So we want to provide all that information to the consumer and to the provider through the NCPDP standard so that the provider and the consumer at the point of prescribing can make a mutual decision as to which drug they want to be on. It may be the cheapest, it may not be the cheapest, it may be the one that's most efficacious for them. That decision-making process is between the provider and the patient. Both should be empowered to have the information that they need at the point of prescribing to make that happen. And so that's the work we're doing on real-time pharmacy benefit check, or a consumer-facing version. We often get asked, there's Da Vinci and then there's CARIN, and how do you guys overlap? And what do these things look like that you're both working on? This is a good, I think, really high-level overview about how we break this down. If it's a default, the answer is Da Vinci's working on it. They're working on about 65 use cases as we speak, unless it's changed from this morning yet, I don't know. related to what's going on. So it may be 75 what if we do what's going on. That's right. So no, we joke, but we're in constant contact. We're just working on 2. It's kind of like David and Goliath. We want to be Da Vinci when we get older. But for us, what we're trying to do is find ways where like I said, our focus from the claims perspective is on the financial component. So Da Vinci is focusing on the clinical aspect of US Core and specifically US CDI and mapping those resources from the payer to the actual clinical resources in the EHR itself. We're focusing on providing that financial information, the financial data, so that allowed amount, paid amount, all the other amounts that are associated with that can be provided directly to the consumer through a third-party app of their choice. And the other side, as we mentioned, is on pharma, under real-time pharmacy benefit check. There's some information that Da Vinci's putting together for formulary and benefit information that we're going to borrow as it relates to the actual resources themselves and the mappings that are concerned. And then we're going to take on the broader information for doing real-time benefit checks. So we can get into more detail about this later, but just wanted folks to have that as kind of reference. Final slide, I'm going to turn over to Amol so he can talk tech with you on our CARIN Blue Button implementation guide. So this just gives you a rough idea that we have a ridiculous timeline in front of us. And this is all very estimated at this point, but our thought is we have gotten approval from all of the necessary parties at this point from a project scope statement perspective for both projects with HL7 and also some agreements from NCPDP as well. And so we're moving ahead very quickly to make this happen. We started this with Blue Button kind of Q4 of last year. We started this in real-time pharmacy benefit check Q1 of this year. And so this gives you an idea of where we are. Amol's going to talk to you about the CARIN Blue Button implementation guide that's the farthest along and that you'll be able to see that information. We are actively looking for organizations, especially payers, that want to participate in a reference implementation and through testing. So if you're an organization that would be interested in that, please come see us afterwards and to participate in this. Meetings are open, so we can be able to have you as part of this process, but we're very interested in doing that. And then ultimately, the hope is that we can ballot this in the next ballot coming up in the February timeframe for both of these standards. So with that, I will turn it over to Amol to talk more in detail about the implementation guide.
Thanks, Ryan. Can folks hear me? Awesome. And it's not going to be that techy. Hopefully this is something that kind of resonates with everybody here in terms of what we're trying to do through the Blue Button implementation guide. At the very outset, I want to kind of applaud CMS for kind of taking the lead in exposing consumer APIs, exposing payer domain data for Medicare beneficiaries. I know Mark Strimshire is here from the CMS Blue Button team, and that has been the motivator for several of the things in this implementation guide. Like Ryan mentioned, we have also been inspired by the Argonaut project approach. In fact, our approach is a hybrid one. We have leveraged the Argonaut project, and we are also going with the balloting process, like Ryan mentioned, with the PSS. And essentially, we are defining a data set for payers. And we're starting with EOBs for now. There's going to be other domains down the pipeline, but essentially, we're calling it the Common Payer Consumer Data Set that defines what an EOB representation would be for a typical payer, and not just CMS, but commercial payers out there as well. But our inspiration, our reference has been, like I said, the CMS Blue Button API content. We are also, at this point, defining profiles that would cover the use case for accessing this, this data represented via the CPCDS. The implementation guide, like I said, kind of holds all of these artifacts together. And then there's a few things further down the pipeline that we're going to look at to make implementations easier for the payers. And those include a flat file specification for CPCDS, a mapping to X12, EDI. Hopefully, the payers will have lots of options to create and stand up these data release platforms for their members. Just a quick kind of comparison, compare and contrast between the Argonaut project and the CARIN Blue Button implementation guide for folks who are familiar with the Argonaut project. Like I said, we're all kind of, both of these projects are kind of starting with the logical data specification. As far as the Argonaut, the ONC defined the common clinical data set, now morphing into the USCDI V1. In the case of CARIN Blue Button implementation guide, CARIN has defined the common payer consumer data set. This deck kind of captures the creation of the common payer consumer data set. Like I said, our reference is the CMS Medicare Blue Button API content model. We have paired it with feedback from commercial health plans and other vendors that deal with payer data, especially claims data. And we have collected this feedback, and we have come up with a data set that represents the number of elements that meet the CMS Blue Button API and also exceeds that core CMS content model. The idea there is that the CPCDS will exceed to accommodate more pieces of explanation of benefit or claims data for consumers, but also expand to include other domains. For example, eligibility, benefit, enrollment, and so forth. And that would be reflected through versioning of the CPCDS. This kind of speaks to the guts of the implementation guide and how we've created a logical data set for payers, and where does this logical data set kind of hit the ground, as in map into these concrete FHIR profiles, specifically the elements within the profile FHIR resources. All of this information is available on a link, a bill.fhir.org link that I'll share at the end of this slide. So folks can kind of take a look at it, and most importantly to us, provide us feedback on whether we need to kind of tweak some of the mappings or kind of consider some data elements that we might have missed. There are some fields here, for example, the claim billing provider network status that are not yet mapped, simply because the FHIR resources or profiles out there do not address the specific element. So we're going to be talking, in this balloting process, we're going to be talking to various work groups within the FHIR organization, HL7 FHIR organization, about ways to make sure that all of these elements that are stored with a payer have a FHIR element representation. And one of the, I guess I should mention that one of the yardsticks of this implementation guide is to expose financial information to members. And to that effect, we have basically mapped the amounts at the claim header level as well as the line level. And that's reflected from the claim and claim line sections of the CPCDS. This is the drug portion. Again, the CPCDS is what you can call a canonical representation of claims data, adjudicated claims data at a payer. And so it has been built so that it can express all of these flavors of claims or types of claims in a single canonical model. The thought is that as these canonical data elements map to profiles, concrete profiles, they would manifest as specific types of claims or EOBs. So you would have a pharmacy profile that would capture the drug portions of the logical CPCDS. There are some elements here, like I said, are not yet mapped, where we would invite feedback from folks here as they are thinking about implementation of this API. Some of the elements need extensions, definition of extensions. Obviously, need to make sure that no other profile or no other resource is covering it already, because we don't want extensions mushrooming all over the place. Diagnosis procedure, all the standard claims elements, and also related domains as well, including this member domain. There's also a coverage domain that we're going to model just to capture the relationship between member and EOB. Another important part of an implementation guide is terminologies and how do you bind those terminologies to the specific elements. To that effect, we are creating terminology bindings where there's a gap and extending some where we need to incorporate a pair view of what the value set might be. So towards that, we are starting to not boil the whole ocean, because there's a whole lot of terminologies in the payer space, DRGs, type of bill codes, and so forth that exist, but they exist in a different form. For example, CMS is the owner of the DRG terminology, specifically the MS DRG terminology, and they expose that information through a specific format. It's not FHIR-friendly terminology service, but it's a different format. So we're kind of mentioning that any client app for validation of a response received from a FHIR API that contains MSDRGs use some sort of a process to download the CMS MSDRGs and validate those values for now. In the target state or a future state, I believe we're kind of pushing for CMS and other terminology owners to stand up FHIR terminology services or FHIR compliant terminology services that would make it easier for these client apps to validate the values that they get for these elements. But again, that's an ongoing campaign, if you will. These are the claim type values that we have come up with. The shaded, the yellow shaded ones kind of represent the new or changed types that we are going to be proposing to HL7 FM. Again, this is just late-breaking draft version, and we're going to be engaging with the right HL7 work groups to make sure that there is consensus around what the best practice and patterns are for representing these domain-specific things. this is again a kind of a representation of how external terminologies, external as in CMS DRGs and type of bill terminologies would be bound to the profile. Another important aspect of terminologies is versioning. You also want to track the version of terminology that you are binding to and allow for the versions to vary because most terminologies kind of get updated on a regular basis. And FHIR does support that, representing the versioning concept. So it really kind of makes it easier for a FHIR-based terminology service to support a client API or client app validation. And just to kind of summarize, these are the specific terminologies that we are kind of targeting. Some of them will be hosted on or as HL7 terminologies. Some of them will likely be given as examples, but pointing to the terminology owner. For example, I said MSDRGs for the complete set. RX norm is another example where the National Library of Medicine has the complete, or rather controls RX norm terminology, but we would either point to it, cite some examples and point to it, and hopefully there would be easier way for these client apps to kind of interface with them, with the owner terminology systems. I want to open it up to, I think we are at time, but I want to open it up for a couple of questions maybe. But do note the website at the end of this slide, at the bottom of the slide, where you folks can take a look at the draft version of the implementation guide and find the mappings as well as the profiles that we have created as draft. Thank you. Any questions? Go ahead.
Real quick.
Is there any harmonization between X12's 835 standards process and this? Because it seems like they're pretty tightly coupled.
I told you we'd get that question, Amol.
Go ahead.
The answer is not yet, but there will be. So the question was the harmonization between X12 and this EOB information. What's the work going on right there? So in the last couple of weeks, we did get feedback from our health plan clients that one of the ways that they may look at implementing this is mapping X12 directly to FHIR. So X12 owns that. It's proprietary, as you know, and so we've reached out in the last couple of weeks, engaged with X12. They're going to do the mappings to a FHIR resources. We're going to include that as part of the implementation guide. It's a quick answer. Over here, we're a couple minutes over, so I want to be cognizant of time. But last question, was there some? Yes, go ahead.
So you talked about Medicare and how a timeline and a roadmap for the other payers. Now, where does Medicaid fit into this whole equation?
Good question. They're way behind. Sorry, just kind of facts. How does Medicaid fit into this? We talked about Medicare and commercial, and they're taking the lead. Medicaid is far behind. So we work on, Levitt works with a number of state Medicaid agencies, about 10 of them, as well as MMIS vendors too. So if you're in the Medicaid space, love to talk to you about it. We have, the approach we're taking is, once we get this to a good state, which should be in the next 30 days, where it's stable, then we want to, and also map to X12, we want to then give it to the Medicaid agencies to then be able to look at it to see from a Medicaid perspective if there's any adjustments need to be made. But they are also under the same regulation as CMS. Amol and I will be out in the hall if you have any other questions, but thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.